डिस्कस करेंगे कि बड़े सगीर में ब्रिटिश कॉलोनियलिज्म के थ्रू मॉडर्निज्म कैसे आया और वेरियस रिस्पॉन्सेस क्या थी। और इसमें एक जो सबसे इम्पोर्टेंट पहलू है वो मेरे ख्याल में ये है कि रूट्स जो जड़ें हैं सारे आजकल मतलब हम देखते हैं सब कॉन्टिनेंट में डिफरेंट इस्लामिक मूवमेंट्स, इस्लामिक फिगर्स, बहुत ज़्यादा डाइवर्सिटी है। बहुत लोग इस्लाम पे बहुत तरीक़ों से बातें करते हैं। many different voices. Or to a casual observer, it's sometimes quite bewildering of, where are these voices coming from? What are they, how are their perspectives different from each other? How could the interpretations of Islam be so different in these different movements, different personages who are interpreting Islam in many different ways. So how did this situation come to be that there are very many voices, of course, in Islamic history. There have been many different voices. It's never, Islam does not have one interpretation, despite kind of popular opinion. Oftentimes in my classes, when I teach, or rather, I tell students that the only question you can't ask is, what does Islam say about such and such a thing? And there's a reason for that. And because Islam doesn't say anything about anything. I mean, Islam is not, I tell my students, if you want to know what Islam says about something, go out onto the street, look for Islam. If you can find Islam, ask Islam, what do you say about such a, this matter or that matter? The only thing we can know is that what do Muslims say? How are they? Of course, we have the scripture, we have the Quran, the Hadith, other sources of Islam. Those, of course, being the major sources, the Sunnah. But how they are interpreted, how they are, what tradition of interpretation they fall into. How people come to understand them has always been quite diverse, a lot more diverse than most Muslims are comfortable with. Most Muslims today who have been kind of taught for various reasons that Islam is this one thing that says this about this part of life and says that about another thing. In reality, Islam has been many different things to many different people. So that's kind of a larger historical argument here. But in the subcontinent, in South Asia, the current opinions or current perspectives on Islam can almost always be traced back to the time of Muslims' encounter with colonial or Western modernity. And this is not actually, one perhaps shouldn't say, can be traced back to, because it's an ongoing process. This encounter that Muslims are having with modernity is an ongoing process. It's still happening. But what's interesting here is that what we looked at last time, that the major responses have continued to stay with us. And the roots of those responses are really in that initial colonial encounter with modernism, with modernity, with a completely new civilization that Muslims had never encountered before. And as we spoke last time, that this was quite different from other encounters Muslims had with other civilizations in the past. due to it's a really anomalous perspective. So anomalous here meaning unique, but not necessarily in a good sense. It depends. I mean, it could be neutral. That there's something different about modern Western civilization. And in your, I'm sure you're taking classes on modernism and so forth. We talked a little bit about it, but very briefly, the rise of modern science, the rise of modern rationalism, a way of interpreting epistemology or a way of interpreting the world, which is largely, which is not based on revelation, it's not based on spiritual experience, it's not based on transmission of sacred ideas or practices or norms. Rather, it's based on the capacity of human reason. It's based on the kind of limits that a modern scientific perspective puts in the world, in the sense that it can really only look at physical reality. Modern science is very much about the study of physical reality. So the modernist perspective oftentimes does not go beyond that. That physical reality is seen as the only reality, which is really the only reality. And all other forms of reality are then left to kind of, you're left to argue about whether it's real or not. Anyways, that's a larger philosophical question we don't have time for today. But going back to the different responses to modernity that Muslims in the subcontinent have, how it's important for us today is not that this is just a study of people that lived in the 19th century or something like that, but that contemporary movements, contemporary schools of thought, contemporary even institutions that exist in the subcontinent as well as elsewhere in the Islamic world are rooted in this encounter with the West. And this might seem quite reactionary, and unfortunately, it is, at least to a large degree. Not every single Muslim movement or figure and so forth has been reactionary, but within the context of having to respond to a foreign military, political, and later cultural domination, and as well as the ideas that came with that. Muslims have often been on the receiving end. So by reactionary, I mean in the sense that it's reactionary. It's not necessarily the natural organic development of ideas based on the Quran or something. It's a lot of what Muslims have done in the last couple of centuries has been to respond to the West. And be that as it may, that's kind of a part of the reality of, or part of the historical dimension of this issue. But we'll see that not everybody has only been reactionary. But being reactionary is one of the kind of major themes that we see here. So Muslims in South Asia first encountered the Europeans. We usually speak of European discovery of this and that, but which is a very Eurocentric way of looking at things. So, looking at what does the Muslim discovery of Europe look like? So the Muslims kind of discovered Europe in South Asia, at least South Asian Muslims, subcontinent, Muslims in the subcontinent, as well as other people in the subcontinent. Europeans, for the first time, when Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. That was in 1497. Ironically, he was only able to do that with the help of Muslim navigators. And although that initial encounter did not result in other than eventual establishment of certain areas of Portuguese domination, such as Goa, it did not result in a major kind of takeover or something like that, but it opened the doors for European expansion into South Asia. And one of the major ways that it did that was to take away the use of or at least severely compromise the use of the Indian Ocean, which was largely, which was actually one of the ways in which Muslim empires were able to interchange their ideas to kind of build domination, and part of their political and economic strength came from this control of the Indian Ocean, which was then gradually ceded, and eventually other European powers, for South Asia, of course, the most important being the British, really the only real important power, although the French had Pondicherry and other places as well, but really the British came into India as first the British East India Company. And this was in something like the first decade of the 17th century. And they came as traders, saying that, you know, they just wanted to establish trade with India, with, when I say India here, I mean Hindustan, the old India, which includes all of South Asia. That you know, they were traders, but very soon, because of the development of modern forms of technology, which could be used, particularly weaponry, as well as we saw with Napoleon and so forth, other means of with the British, actually, it really started. The other means that we see with Napoleon of domination of territory or domination of a culture by kind of studying it, classifying it, controlling it through knowledge, occurs later. And again, you know, I wish we had more time. I could speak about that, but and we're not going to go into that. But there was dominations not only, as we oftentimes think, through kind of military means. It's also by, and even more so by military means, is really powerful domination comes through knowledge. By creating forms of knowledge and therefore transforming traditional forms of knowledge through which South Asians understood themselves and understood the world, and replacing that with a British, modern Western way of knowing and content of knowledge in which made both the South Asian, whether we're talking the Muslim or Hindu, ways of knowing religious and philosophical kind of obsolete, or made them, you know, they became privatized. Yeah, anyway, so the important point being that knowledge, the domination through knowledge, by introducing new forms of knowledge, and by as we saw in the Hindu-Muslim lecture, by you know, Hindu-Muslim conflict it comes, for example, one of its sources is that the British basically created a new form of knowledge, this kind of supposed mutual antagonism and fighting that had gone on, which didn't really have any real reality. It had some basis, of course, that they drew on, but it replaced the experience of Muslims and Hindus in South Asia with a new narrative, which claimed to now tell us the story of Hindu-Muslim relations in a new way. Anyways, I hope that is at least somewhat clear. But going back to the British domination, the kind of political domination. So it starts with the East India Company. So by the throughout the 18th century, so start of 1700s, as the Indian, as particularly Muslim power in India, in Hindustan wanes with the death of Aurangzeb in 1707. The last major Mughal emperor dies, and after that, it's a period of much weaker Mughal power. There's takeover, for example, the invasion of Nadir Shah. There's interesting kind of fighting between different groups. There's the Marathas rising in parts of of India, and the British take advantage of this, and this colonial or the company expands and slowly is able to not just be a trading company, because they bring soldiers in, they bring administrators in, and within less than 100 years, they're rulers of large parts of South Asia, large parts of the subcontinent. So by 1757, for example, many of the provinces are under British rule in some kind of way. By 1790, Governor General Cornwallis has enough power to replace Islamic law in those areas where it is practiced with a new something called Anglo-Muhammadan law, in which kind of combines some of the some aspects of Islamic law with British law. Under Wellesley, another Governor General who rules from 1798 to 1805, the conquest really is complete, in the sense that by 1803 the British enter the capital of the Mughal Empire, Delhi, and after that the Mughal Emperor becomes a puppet of the British as long as the Mughal Empire survives, and that's until 1857. And we'll get to that in a second. But to see, for example, that on the political front, how some Muslims perceive these developments, and how there was a important realization among the ulama, at least, or certain of the Muslim intelligentsia, that this was something unprecedented, that this was not just another conquest. And you can see this, for example, in the fatwa, the famous fatwa of Shah Abdul Aziz, who I think he dies in 1824, born in the mid-18th century. I'm forgetting the exact date of when this fatwa was given, but I think it was the late 18th century or early 19th century, late 18th century, in which he argued, and he was kind of the greatest religious authority of his day. He was kind of most important alim living in Delhi, the seat of the Mughal Empire, and he argued once that the British had taken over. So yeah, I think it was early 19th century. Once the British had taken over Delhi, he argued that India had now become Darul Harb. And while under the Marathas, when the Marathas were ruling, were also a foreign force, in the sense of non-Muslim force, it had still been Darul Islam. So that might, come as a surprise of, these are both non-Muslim adversaries. What is different about them? Why is Shah Abdul Aziz giving a fatwa that India has become Darul Harb for? So for those of you that might not know, this means these distinctions in Islamic law about a land, the abode of Islam in a place where Islam can be practiced, or is the rulership is Muslim, where Islamic law can be practiced, where Friday prayer can be established, is Darul Islam. And a place where it can't, where there's actually open hostility or inability for Muslims to practice their religion, would be Darul Harb. Of course, there's in-between places, for example, Darul Sulh and so forth, that the jurists devised, which meant places that might not have been ruled by Muslims, but in which Muslims were free to practice their religion and as a minority or something like that. So it's interesting that Shah Abdul Aziz uses this fatwa to argue for India as Darul Harb. And so in this, perhaps one can see that he has this, he's able to see that the British are not common enemies, like the Marathas, who just kind of take over the land, or take over political rulership from the Muslims, but rather that they represented something far more dangerous. And for example, that the Marathas are not going to create Maratha Muslim law or something like that. That the British had forms of knowledge that they would try to impose upon the Muslims, and would try to reshape Muslim culture and society, as well as one could say with the Hindu and so forth as well in South Asia. And so here you see kind of the first kind of awareness of modernity among South Asian Muslims is in this fatwa. Not necessarily the very first, but one of the first major pronouncements if you trace the history of the encounter with modernity for South Asian Muslims. So Shah Abdul Aziz's concerns were, of course, not unfounded. For after the kind of the abolition of the Sharia or Islamic law, the British next discouraged and actually banned, at least as on public instruction, the use of Persian, of Farsi, which was the lingua franca of Muslim India. That's what divided, that's what united large parts of North Indian Muslims amongst themselves, and as well as with other religious groups. Even the Hindus of North India spoke or were able, carried out a lot of both administrative as well as intellectual activity in Persian. And so this was also, of course, the language in which the majority of Muslim religious literature, as well as intellectual, all forms of literature, was composed. So the ceasing of studying of Persian, of course, one could do it privately or in the madaris and so forth. That still continued, but in kind of official public schools was also an undermining of the whole heritage of Muslim India. So, and you know, Persian was abolished as the language of public instruction and replaced by English. So, one of the ways that, again, the Muslim elite or intelligentsia, largely considered the ulama, as well as Sufia and so forth, dealt with this is through the cultivation of Urdu. So a lot of the Islamic heritage, one of the great kind of cultural productions in South Asia in the last couple of centuries has been the wholesale translation. And translation, I don't here mean kind of a word-for-word translation, a kind of reinterpretation, both of kind of literal translation, but also a reinterpretation of the a lot of the corpus of Islamic literature into Urdu, largely in order to preserve it once Farsi becomes less and less. Despite these kinds of developments in which the British abolish both Islamic law and they abolish Persian, the British generally were quite at the beginning, at least, were quite, what's the word? They understood that the major aims of their domination, which were initially political and economic, could be compromised if they threatened the culture of their subjects too much. So there was also a very strong argument, and you can see this, for example, in debates within England about how to conduct British rule in India, debates in Parliament. For example, the famous conservative theorist Edmund Burke had argued something like this: that to not interfere necessarily with the religious practices of Indians. Because that could easily lead to unrest, which would not be good for British rule. And this is quite contrasted with some, for example, the French, who would go in with, as what I talked about last time, mission civilisatrice, the idea of civilizing mission, that we have to actually transform these people to have European values, European ways of thinking, and so on. Nonetheless, within Britain, this debate was increasingly came to favor those people that did want the British to intellectually push modernism and kind of British values, British ideas in India. Oftentimes this debate is called the Orientalist-Anglicist debate, in which the Orientalists argue that that Indian religion, culture, languages, and so forth should be left alone. That there's actually oftentimes the Orientalists would even argue, this is not Orientalist in the sense of Edward Said, it's within this debate, those people that were arguing that there's something valuable for the Orient, or at least arguing that, you know, these languages are ancient languages, cultures are significant, to kind of leave these alone, versus Anglicists who wanted to spread the English view of the world and thought that part of occupying India for just kind of political and economic reasons was not a good enough reason to be there, that it was important to have a moral ground to be there, and for them the moral ground was that these people are living in ignorance, in backwardness, in superstition, and we should bring British values, modern forms of thought, rationalism, science, and so forth, and really spread this among the natives of India. And the Anglicists eventually kind of won out. And in the early to late 19th century, you see more and more that the British are not as conservative in their ideas about not interfering with religion and so on. So, right. So British domination, nonetheless, was still, as opposed to say French, the places of that the French occupied, was still largely political and economic, although it had all these other dimensions and eventually resulted in a massive import of Western ideas. But one way that the British were able to influence, other than in institutions and so forth, but intellectually influence culture among Muslims in South Asia was largely through other Muslims. So one of the ways that Muslims responded to the coming of the British and the spread or the introduction of modern ideas was to embrace them. And in this also there was a historical reason, and that was the 1857, what in Pakistan we call War of Independence, but that's politically loaded, as is mutiny, which the British use, that's politically loaded as well. So whatever, War of Independence, mutiny, uprising, whatever happened in 1857, that changed the equation, because now the Muslims, particularly in India, came to be at the forefront. They were seen by the British as leading this mutiny or leading this kind of rebellion, for what the British thought was a rebellion, this battle, and in the aftermath, the British razed mosques, they executed large numbers of people, they imprisoned a large number of Muslims, including many of the foremost ulama, even those that were serving under the British. For example, Fazl Khairabadi, the great philosopher, to the Andaman Islands, the Kalabani. And in this kind of very hostile environment, a group of Muslims, at least, and not in the sense of they all were together and agreed upon this or something, but certain Muslim figures started arguing that that our only choice now, in a certain sense, we've been defeated. Our only choice now is to join the British, and the way to join the British is to embrace the viewpoint of the British, whether this is on a cultural level or whether this is on an intellectual level. So everything from Victorian norms of behavior to modern scientific and rationalistic ways of viewing the world, which would have previously seemed to be to Muslims and the Muslim intelligence as being largely opposed to traditional Islamic ideas and norms. So there are, of course, many different figures who embrace Muslim modernism, and there are some early figures that we don't know as much about. They don't figure into our textbooks as much. For example, Karamat Ali Jaunpuri, who's one of the first people to argue this idea that becomes a staple of modernist thought, that whatever modern European civilization has to offer is already found in the Quran. Of course, this is like, for any kind of, again, we don't have time to go into this deeply, but that's an extremely ahistorical claim. It's an apologetic claim in which it is trying to locate something that is trying to, basically reassert the importance of Islam and Islamic civilization by saying, by trying to bring them into harmony with whatever ideas are popular. In this time, these are the ideas of Victorian naturalism and rationalism. But Karamat Ali Jaunpuri does not have a major following. The person who really is the father of Islamic modernism, or Muslim modernism rather, in South Asia is, of course, Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan. And again, we could say a lot about his ideas. And beyond his educational philosophy, he's of course most famous for establishing Aligarh. But I think that many people in India and Pakistan who've studied or known about Sayyid Ahmad Khan, if they actually came across the kind of ideas he espoused, would be shocked because his interpretation was sometimes extremely radical. It was a very far-reaching reinterpretation of Islam and a putting of Islam, or rather a conforming Islamic doctrines and ideas to the ideas of Victorian naturalism. So, for example, there's a couple of examples of that. Again, time-wise, we can't get deeply into it, but is that Sayyid Ahmad Khan had and one could say, this was obviously in any kind of situation in which there's an enemy. We spoke about this a little bit last time. You can either join them, fight them, or kind of go on your merry way, like don't engage them. And in this case, he Sayyid Ahmad thought to be prudent. The most prudent thing for Muslims to do was to kind of join the British. And so to give kind of a concrete idea of some of his ideas, and is that because of this, his focus on naturalism. So, for example, Maulud al-Afghani, who's also a modernist in a different way, called very polemically, called him a naturey. But there's some truth to that as well, in the sense that Victorian ideas of naturalism are very predominant in kind of the intellectual work of Sayyid Ahmad Khan, and that's why he got a lot of the opposition he did when he first came out with these ideas. So in this, for example, for him, there was nothing. The supernatural was outside the domain of modern science, and therefore any hint of supernaturalism that's to be found in the Quran, in the Hadith, he would rationalize because it did not quite fit with this mechanistic view of nature, which went with which was the particular perspective of 19th century kind of Victorian naturalism, in which the universe, was kind of a closed system which obeyed certain laws of mechanics and physics, and which is invariably characterized by a uniformity of behavior, in which there cannot be any exceptions. So that nature works in a particular way, and there cannot be anything that goes against that. And so anything like a miracle, anything like even divine revelation, the idea that there are angels, or shayateen, or that there are that God actively kind of intercedes in the world, is largely not only absent but is reinterpreted by Sayyid Ahmad Khan or Sir Sayyid as in different ways. So angels, for example, he sees are just the natural properties of things. It's like fluidity in water, or hardness in stone. That's what angel, or for example, the intellect in the human being. That's what an angel is. Or it could mean like divine moral support. Satan refers to the dark passions of man. The jinn are not real. They're just kind of referred to projection of evil, disease, or other calamities. The idea that there's divine punishment through, say, natural disasters are just kind of popular tales that God kind of uses because that's how people think or something in the Quran, rather than being rationalist, objective realities. So in this, the idea is that the laws of nature are immutable, and they're pledges to God, pledges of God to His creation that cannot be broken. So, for example, he argues, therefore, to believe in a miracle is to believe in the suspension of reversal of these laws that are established by God. And so he actually comes to argue something like, if you believe in a miracle, you're actually going against the divine wisdom or divine providence. So one of the aspects of this also is that God is kind of removed from creation. He kind of sets the world in order in the form of deism. And for example, some of the founding fathers of the United States were deists. And so the deist perspective is that God is just kind of the clockmaker. It's the clockmaker God. God sets the world in motion, and then just kind of, that's it. And then the world operates according to its own natural laws, and so on. So there isn't any kind of divine interference or even presence in creation. And this is really the perspective of what you would say, the difference between tanzih and tashbih, if you're familiar with Islamic theology, certain forms of Islamic theology. The perspective of tanzih is that of God's remoteness or of His transcendence, God's majesty, while the perspective of tashbih is about God's immanence, about His closeness to humanity. So these ideas. So in Sayyid Ahmad Khan's world, tanzih, God only possesses tanzih. While in kind of traditional Islamic thought, there's always a balance between tanzih and tashbih. God is both transcendent. He's other than the world, as for Surah Al-Ikhlas, the last phrase, that there is nothing like unto God. But at the same time, in the Quran, God says that He's closer to us than our jugular vein. So in traditional Islamic thought, and I'm kind of speaking about very broad ideas in very succinct form. We could talk more about this. In Sayyid Ahmad Khan's perspective, tanzih ultimately becomes the main approach or main way of looking at God. God is kind of like a clockmaker God. He's not a God that interferes. And that's why even something like revelation, like wahi, he explains naturalistically that, it's kind of a development of an extraordinary person to truly know the reality of the world. It's not Nabuwa or something doesn't come from God choosing a prophet. Wahi is not about an angel coming down and informing human beings about God, or communicating or bringing communications, words from God. but rather it's a natural human development in which a human being comes to have the most amount of knowledge possible for a human being. So anyways, there's other dimensions to this, Darwinism and so forth, as well as the embrace of Darwinism and kind of evolutionary views of the world, and also the reinterpretation of Islamic law, and particularly hadith, which becomes quite important and is still kind of with us in to some degree in various forms of modernism in South Asia. Really begins with Sir Sayyid as well, a kind of a questioning of the hadith, particularly when they do not correspond with reason or with kind of modern moral norms, which in his case are Victorian norms, but they keep on changing in the West, and then Muslims respond often, at least by trying to argue or apologize sometimes for hadith or as well as forms of Islamic law that seem to be embarrassing in a modern to a modern mentality or something like that. But this perspective is much further taken by people like Chirag Ali, who's a kind of a radical proponent of modernism, is one of the main disciples of Sayyid Ahmad Khan, and but there's also other modernists that arise in the subcontinent. Most of them, in some way, have some kind of intellectual depth to Sir Sayyid, and in some ways they sometimes take Sir Sayyid ideas even further. In the case of Chirag Ali, sometimes they bring his ideas closer to kind of more traditional interpretations of Islam, and you see that, for example, in Shibli Nawani, who's an alim, who's one of the founders of Nadwatul Ulama in Lucknow, but who is also definitely largely influenced by Sir Sayyid, as well as kind of other British scholars and so forth that he was friends with, like Thomas Arnold and so forth. But nonetheless, his ideas are much easier to digest for kind of the both Muslim masses as well as the ulama and so forth than Sir Sayyid's. So and there's of course even other people like Altaf Hussain Hali, who takes some of these ideas and kind of propounds them in poetic form. And with Hali, you also see something like the growth of nationalism and so forth, or that kind of nationalist Islam. So, and there are other people who can be called modernists who do not, are not necessarily directly indebted to Sir Sayyid. Most important person in that, and again, this is of course quite debatable whether he's a modernist or not, but in his early thought, I'm talking about Allama Iqbal, but in his early thought there's definitely strains of modernism, but it's a different form of modernism. He has his own independent engagement. It's a much more kind of authentic engagement, one could say, than kind of just, we have to kind of get along with the British, therefore let's embrace these ideas. He reads Nietzsche and Bergson and tries to synthesize various Western ideas with Islamic ideas from Rumi and other people, and to come up with a very very original, and that's partially why he's so influential and celebrated, is a very kind of original vision. So modernism, among at least the intelligentsia as well as in education, largely spreads through these ideas of Sayyid. A lot of the more radical ideas are not, don't gain popularity. They're too much to handle for most Muslims. But some of the general ideas of rationality and modern science and interpreting Islam in these kinds of ways do become quite popular due to kind of more toned down or watered down versions of Sir Sayyid's perspective, or or those of many of the people influenced by him. So we can see now, tying this up with what we were talking about last week, that this is the first of the major responses to modernism, to actually modernity, and it's the modernist response that there is that in embracing of modern ideas. The other responses, before I go. Responses. And you see a variety of responses. Not all of them are just to the fact that the Muslims lost in 1857, or Indians generally. They also are because of a lot of modern developments, the rise of print, the rise of a public sphere in the sense of mass education, print, mass communication, the fact that anybody can now talk about Islam. So these kinds of changes bring a quiet, fertile development of responses and of new ways of interpreting Islam, as well as engaging modernity or opposing modernity, or which at that time really means opposing or the British, or kind of British Western modernity. So one of the responses that we see actually comes when modernism is embraced by Muslim intelligentsia, people like Sayyid Ahmad Khan and his followers. Then part of the problem with the ulama is not that they were just sitting around. It's just that they didn't speak English. They didn't speak these kinds of languages, and it wasn't something that you immediately did as soon as a foreign power came. So when these when Muslim modernists were oftentimes people, not in the case of Sayyid Ahmad Khan, but eventually more and more people who were educated in some way or had some interaction with the British, kind of direct interaction with the British, who had gone to England, or now once the schools were established, they had gone to British kinds of schools, and those are the people that kind of carried forward the ideas of modernism. And a lot of them, these ideas then came to percolate and be distributed through print and other media in Urdu and other Islamic languages. And once that happens, you see that there are the responses proliferate. So you have on one hand the Ahl Hadith, for example, what could be the main representatives of what I call the fundamentalist. Another way of perhaps putting it, some people think the word fundamentalist shouldn't be used. It has too many pejorative kind of or negative connotations. One can also say a reformist, in the sense of that they're kind of taking the Islamic tradition and reforming it in some kind of way, not in a modern way, but in the sense of going back to the Quran and Hadith, or focusing only on the Quran and Hadith. So with Ahl Hadith, that is one fundamentalist or reformist response, which says that the problem is actually the exact wrong way is to kind of go and adopt the ways of the British. What we have to do is go back to the Quran and Sunnah, and our tradition declined because we're not following the Quran and Sunnah. And this is, again, even today you have various kinds of movements that have this perspective. But the first of these were the Ahl Hadith. Later on, for example, you have movements which are much more political in nature, but ideologically have some of the same ideas. For example, Jamaat-e-Islami, or the perspective of Maulana Maududi, who also, although he's a much more kind of a rich thinker, in the sense that he has a lot of creative and original ideas, the Ahl Hadith are really textualists who just want to kind of study the Hadith and so forth. But his perspective aligns in many ways, in the sense that the later tradition is not important. We must kind of go back to the Quran and Sunnah. So this is one major response that you see among Indian Muslims. But you also see a different response among the ulama, and in which there's ulama definitely who continue to say that that these modern ideas, they have nothing to do with us. We're just going to continue to teach things as we previously taught them, and that the best way for the preservation of Islam is to just kind of continue transmitting it. And sometimes this is quite creative, translating things into Urdu, or ulama among some of the most avid users of the modern printing press, or it's a way of kind of reinterpreting some of these ideas for a modern audience, but still kind of sticking to the tradition. But among the ulama, there are also arise a smaller number of people, and amongst Sufis as well, and later on among kind of university-educated Muslims as well, who are much more, with what I think Hussein was saying, a much more self-conscious engagement and critique of modernity on an intellectual level. And you see this, for example, most prominently, although one of the first people you see this is in the main kind of opponent or critic among the ulama of Sayyid Ahmed Khan, who was Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi. Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi, who was one of the founders of the school of Deoband, writes a kind of a theological response to Sayyid Ahmed Khan. But you especially, and he also, another thing that Maulana Nanotwi does is he engages, this is an aspect of things that I think also speaks to Hussein's earlier question, that there was also, along with the rise of modernity, what British rule also did, again in the later period after kind of the Anglicists had won out, is that Christian missionaries had started coming into South Asia and had been given kind of free rein by the British government to preach to Hindus and Muslims. And in this preaching, they was seen as a major threat. And that was another major reason why Muslims started kind of combating or British rule and so forth. And so Maulana Nanotwi, you also see in some of his treatises that he's addressing modernism to the degree that he's familiar with it, but he also is debating intellectually Christian missionaries. He's debating the Arya Samajis, who are kind of somewhat modernist, somewhat fundamentalist, interesting kind of interpretation of Hinduism, in a very newfangled kind of interpretation, which and Arya Samajis were kind of trying to reconvert Muslims back to Hinduism and things like that. But anyways, but the most important person in this was Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi. And some people just know him for Behishti Zevar or something, but that's like really just a kind of one of his most, it's just like the tip of his very voluminous kind of writings. And he clearly, especially in a few treatises, one being Intibahat al-Mufida and Shtahabat al-Jadida, he takes on the ideas of modernism and uses Islamic philosophy to try to argue for, or at least try to poke holes in a modern, in kind of modern thought, modern philosophy and so forth, especially as represented by the Muslim modernists. So among the ulama, various schools formed. So for example, with these two people that I mentioned, Maulana Nanotwi and Maulana Thanvi, they're both from the school of Deoband. And Deoband took on this kind of mantle or perspective that Islam needed to be an important part of kind of public life, or that Islam needed to be preserved in a modern context. And whether there were certain, within Deoband, there were different orientations. There were Deobandis that were very much in favor of kind of Sufi-oriented. There were Deobandis that were all very close to kind of the fundamentalist perspective in the sense of a focus on Quran and Sunnah. And there were, at least in the initial, like people like Maulana Nanotwi, Deobandis were quite intellectually oriented. In the long run, Deoband becomes more and more aligned with a more scripturalist, what we would call fundamentalist kind of perspective. But even then, there's a very strong kind of intellectual engagement with, on a broad level at least, with what's happening in modern developments. Even someone like, although I'm not, I think it's compared to the works of Maulana Thanvi and so forth, very, very rudimentary. But even something, Mufti Taqi Usmani wrote a book on Islam and modernism, Islam or Jadidiyat. It's not a great book, I don't think, but at least there's an attempt to engage here. With Mufti Taqi Usmani also, his economic works are an example of that as well. So I think, let's see. So just to summarize here then, you have the modernist response that comes from Sayyid Ahmad Khan. You have ulama, or the traditional response, one could say, which is represented by the ulama, by many of the Sufi orders, and I would argue that a majority of kind of the common population who kind of stuck to what they knew of Islam, although it was being kind of reinterpreted or represented, reconfigured in a modern context, because something like even print technology changes the way that you interpret religion or how you present religion. And so there are definitely changes that are happening. And the ulama schools can be seen as both as major schools being Deoband and Bareilly. So the school of Ahmad Raza Khan. School, I don't here mean institutions, I mean kind of perspectives of Ahmad Raza Khan of Bareilly, or sometimes popularly called the Bareilwis. And in that was another kind of attempt to preserve Islam in a modern context by focusing on popular practices, oftentimes Sufi-based popular kind of practices associated with shrine culture, with local customs in South Asia and so forth. And but despite the the major, they say sometimes family feuds are the worst. Despite the major opposition that you see, Bareilwis and Deobandis fighting each other and so forth, they both really are representatives of people who are trying to preserve traditional Islam in different ways in the modern period, as opposed to, say, for example, the Ahl Hadith, who are not interested in when I'm talking about traditional Islam, I mean not just taking the Quran and Sunnah, but also the whole classical tradition. So being interested in the Quran and Sunnah and the way it's been interpreted through the centuries, and all the schools that have developed out of it. Schools of philosophy, schools of theology, schools of law, even art and so forth. But and of course Sufism and spirituality. So traditional Islam takes all of these things as significant, and as seeing that all Islamic thought, spirituality, and so forth is coming from the Quran and Sunnah. We don't necessarily have to go back to a purely kind of literal reading of it. So traditional Islam differs from these other movements, whether modernism or whether Ahl Hadith or other forms of fundamentalist or reformist movements, by having a much broader understanding of what the Islamic tradition is. So you get these kinds of, so these again are kind of the main responses: the modernist, the traditionalist, and the what you broadly can call fundamentalist. Mahdist movements still kind of exist. Even something like the Qadiani movement comes from a Mahdist kind of perspective, in which his followers of Mirza Ghulam think that he's the Messiah and the Mahdi and so forth. And it becomes kind of a new religious movement, quite different from the others. But that comes from that kind of background as well. Just I said something about the traditional movement, although also later on gets other proponents who are kind of, might have had a modern education or university education, but who go back and try to argue for traditional Islam and its importance. And there's figures like that in the subcontinent as well. So I think our time is running low, so I'll kind of end here. But I'd